Welcome to Chapter 15, Measurements of Economic Performance for AP Economics Structured Independent Study. As far as measurements of economic performance really go, it's really all about gross domestic product, GDP, what we produce as a society. We'll break GDP, gross domestic product, down a little bit and explain how it works. We'll look at national income, how GDP is actually calculated, the limitations of GDP as a measurement, and also the influences on gross domestic product. We'll look at how we go about illustrating different types of economic conditions based upon this measurement. And we'll also touch on some other measures of economic performance and wrap up this chapter by talking about factors that promote growth within an economy. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's all about gross domestic product, GDP, or what we produce as a society. And here's a real interesting chart. It shows all the countries in the world, and it shows their gross domestic product ranking by head count. We call this measurement GDP per capita. We take the output for the country and we divide the population into it to get an output per head, if you will. And this is a chart from 2007. Notice the word nominal, and back to reference in our previous chapter about our measurements, nominal versus real. So this is the 1 year snapshot, 2007. And over on the left-hand side, you can see the ranking of output per head. And the color blue at the top indicates the most productive countries or societies. And you'll see that the United States is ranked right up there at the top in terms of output and what gets produced by the society. Here's another interesting chart. So large is the United States economy and our output. There are many states, or as a matter of fact, every state in the United States has an individual state GDP in excess or bigger than most countries or many countries' GDP. And here's a matchup of some countries' GDP compared to our states. And I think this is a really interesting way to portray the size difference and impact that the United States economy has versus other countries around the world. So let's get started at how we look at economic performance and specifically measure and track the economy to get our GDP figures. Well, it all starts with the National Income Accounting System. This is a system that collects statistics on production, income, investment, and savings, and it's a system that's run by the Department of Commerce of the federal government. And it's from this system that we figure out GDP. So let's define specifically what GDP is. GDP, or gross domestic product, is defined as the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. Now, there are three real important parts to this definition. Dollar value, it's expressed in dollars. It's based on final goods and services as opposed to intermediate goods and services. And we'll give you examples of the difference between the two here in a few moments. And the goods and services that are produced within a country's borders. Now, that could be even goods and services produced by a foreign company. As long as it's within the country's borders, it gets counted as part of our domestic output. And we'll give you some examples of that as well. GDP has an equation that we use for it to express it. GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And let me give you a feel for traditionally what each of these categories takes up in terms of its percentage contribution to the GDP figure. Consumer consumption roughly runs about 70% of GDP, and by virtue of that number, obviously the most important component. Business investment makes up 28%. Government spending 16%, and net exports minus 14%. Well, how does that work? Well, in recent years, for the better part of the past 15 to pushing 20 years, we have been running trade deficits where we actually have been importing more than we're exporting. So in terms of the most recent or most relevant percentages and figures, the net exports number has been a negative. Let's break down the component parts of that GDP definition to make sure that you have a thorough understanding of what they mean, and also provide some of the examples that I had mentioned a moment ago. Dollar value. What we mean by dollar value is the total of the selling prices of all goods and services that are produced. Final goods, and it's the dollar value of the final goods. And what we mean by final goods are products and services sold to consumers, as opposed to an intermediate good, which is used in the production of the final good. And let me give you two examples. We don't count the sale and the dollar value of nails that go into the building of a house, but we do count the value, the dollar value of the sale of the entire house. Another example, we don't count the dollar value of the glass windshield that goes into making an automobile, but we do count the total price that goes into, makes up the sale of the automobile to the consumer. When we look at the component of the definition that says produced within a country's borders, as I had mentioned a few moments ago, even if it's produced by a foreign company. Another example, and I'll continue on the automotive theme, BMW, Toyota are foreign companies, automotive companies, that have manufacturing and assembly plants here in the United States and dealerships. If the car is produced and manufactured here in the United States by one of those foreign auto companies, it is included in the United States' gross domestic product. There are two ways to calculate the GDP dollar value. Here's the first. It's called the expenditure approach. This is calculating or adding together the amount spent on four categories of final goods and services. The four categories are consumer goods and services, business goods and services, government goods and services, and net exports or imports of goods and services. And since we're measuring things and also talking about final goods and services, this is a good time to define the types of final goods and services that there are. Here's the first type. They're called durable goods. These are goods, most times fairly big ticket items, goods that last for a long period of time. Cars, refrigerators, televisions, and other appliances. The second type of final goods and services are called non-durable goods. These are goods that last for a short period of time, as opposed to durable, which is a long period. And some examples of non-durable goods are things that are perishable, That's another good way to think about non-durable goods. They're perishable. Food falls into this category. Light bulbs fall into this category. A pair of shoes would also fall into the non-durable good category. The second way to calculate GDP is through the income approach. And with this approach, we add up all the incomes in the economy. Now, a couple things about the income approach. First is that it's technically more accurate than the expenditure approach. And the income approach is generally used to cross-check the expenditure approach. They won't match, but they'll come close to providing the same total. They're within a very small measure of each other. Now, in concluding our look at ways to calculate the GDP here for a second, and also our consideration in being able to sort out between final and intermediate goods, let's do one more example. Let's consider the sale of a house, a new home, and also a resale. Now, with a brand new home, the total selling price of the house, the new home, is considered and taken into account, that dollar value. And it's that total price of the house, not the price of the intermediate goods that were used to build the house, that gets counted in GDP. Now, the situation is different for a resale. It's not a new final good when a house is resold from one person to another. And what we count in that case, if we assume that a real estate agent was just used to facilitate the sale, is the only thing that would get counted, and it would be in the income approach category, would be the commission that the real estate agent earned on the sale of the house, bringing the seller and the buyer together. We don't count the price that is paid for the house. Now, somebody might say, hey, what about a house that had some renovation work done on it, and it's now worth more money than it was originally because they added a room or some other addition or asset to the house that made it more valuable? Well, we account for that for when the addition to the home is made. The contractor or the person taking care of the addition winds up sending a bill and asking the homeowner to pay for the work that's done. And at that time, we count the work that's done for either the addition or whatever changes are made to the home as part of the GDP within the year that that occurs. So we get all the aspects of the production covered in the resale environment as well. Now we need to move on to consider the two types of GDP. And in considering the two types of GDP, we relate this to another way of looking at it from a measurement standpoint. I'm going to bring back the terms nominal and real again in this case. Nominal GDP is calculated in current year's prices. And this measurement for GDP is limited because increases in the prices distort our output measurements. They make output in the short term appear to rise. Real GDP, like we've seen with other measurements for real and nominal, uses a base year so that the GDP calculation can be expressed, the production calculation can be expressed in constant or unchanging prices. Now, calculating GDP is guaranteed to show up on the multiple choice section of the AP exam. And they're going to ask you to figure out one of a couple of things, either real GDP, nominal GDP, or something that we call the GDP deflator. So you're going to be given one of the following two two scenarios to figure out. And it's a pretty easy mathematical exercise for you. As you know, you can't use calculators and so forth, so they have to use some pretty easy numbers to work with, and the process is pretty easy. It's just remembering a simple formula. So here's one way how it will be presented. You may be given the real and nominal GDP figures and asked to find what the GDP deflator or price index is. And that's a pretty simple equation. The GDP deflator or price index is equal to the nominal GDP figure divided by the real GDP figure times 100. Here's the other way the question may be presented to you. You may be given the GDP deflator, the price index, and either the real or nominal GDP figure and asked to find the other. So in this case, we just switch our equation around a little bit. Let's say we're asked to find the real GDP figure. We're given the nominal GDP and the deflator, so we just rearrange our equation accordingly. Let's take a look at a couple of examples for this. Let's say for these examples, we're given 2 years and we're given the nominal GDP figure and the GDP deflator or price index. And actually, let's spice it up a little bit here too and add some population figures. And let's say you'll also be asked in one case to find the GDP per capita figure. So we'll tackle that here as well. So here are our figures. Our nominal GDP for year 1 is 4,000. I'm using simple numbers here. Year 2 is 5,800. So to find our real GDP, remember we take our nominal GDP times 100 and divide it by the price index. And for GDP per capita, meaning per head population in the country, we take the real GDP number and divide it by the population of the country or the particular area. So here's the first question for you. What is the real GDP in year 1? And I'll give you a moment or two to try to work the math on that if you have a calculator. And you should come up with 3,076. So here's another exercise. What's the real GDP in year 2? And the answer to that is 3,866. So let's take a crack at the GDP per capita. And what's the real GDP per capita for year 1? We take the 3,076 divided by the population, and it's 307. Here are a couple of more examples and some more practice for you. What would be the real GDP per capita in year 2? The answer to that is 322. Now, extend it a little further. The rate of real GDP or output growth between years 1 and 2. Here we're looking for a percentage of output growth, either an increase or a decrease. Obviously, it's an increase if you just looking at the numbers. The answer to this is 26%. And how about the rate of real growth per capita between years 1 and years 2? And the real growth per capita is 5%. GDP is not a perfect measurement tool for growth within our society and our economy. It does have some limitations, and I'm going to point out the 4 major limitations. The first is that it does not account for non-market activities. And what are non-market activities? They're goods or services that are not generally accounted for and measured. Things such as productive services such as caring for children, mowing the lawn as a family member, cooking dinner, washing the car, and the like. A second thing it does not account for is the underground economy and anything that occurs in a black market. The underground economy is also referred to as under-the-table type transactions and off-the-book transactions. Barter transactions are also not accounted for and therefore do not find their way into the GDP measurement as well. The next or third limitation is with regard to externalities, and we've looked at externalities in the past in Chapter 8 in particular, and also Chapter 4. Here's an example of how an externality is not included in a GDP measurement. Let's take the value of a clean environment. It's not counted, even though a cleaned up lake or a wetlands, as an example, has considerable social value. And the last limitation of GDP is that it doesn't account for quality of life. GDP, remember, measures output and income, not quality of life. So happiness with safety or time off or a certain type of living conditions is not figured into our calculations. We're focused here on output and income, production and income. Now that we have an understanding of what GDP is, let's take it a few steps further in how we go about using it to illustrate economic conditions. In illustrating different types of economic conditions and relating it to what we know about GDP, we're going to introduce you to a couple of additional concepts that you should wind up being pretty comfortable with because they've built on what we've learned in the past, particularly with regard to the principles of supply and demand. So I want to start you with two factors or two additional concepts here as we move forward. The first is the concept of aggregate demand. What aggregate demand is the amount of goods and services in the economy, the entire economy as opposed to a single market, that will be purchased at all possible price levels. The second concept is aggregate supply. And this is the total amount of goods and services in the economy that are produced at all price levels. The concepts of aggregate demand and supply are critically important to our study of macroeconomics, and particularly macroeconomic measurements and being able to illustrate different types of economic conditions. So let's take a look at both of these in a little bit further detail to make sure that we have a solid foundation to work off of. And let's start with aggregate demand. And one of the things we need to do at the outset is to show you how our charts and graphs will be changing slightly to reflect this aggregate approach as opposed to a market-oriented approach. So in starting with aggregate demand, like a market demand curve, an aggregate demand curve is also downward sloping from left to right. And the reason for this is similar to a market demand curve in that at higher price levels, the quantity that is demanded, even in an overall economy, is less than when prices are lower. Now, a couple of things that have changed here on our chart since we're looking at an overall economy. We have some new and very important labels here to note. The first, we change on the y-axis label on our graph from just P, meaning price, to price level in the economy, and it's reflected with the label PL. Also, the quantity label for the x-axis, we still use Q, but it also represents total output for the economy, which, as you may recall from a few moments ago, earlier in this chapter, that's real GDP, or income. And in the financial business, many times you'll see the term income substituted with the letter Y. It's a commonly used designation, the Y letter used to signify income. So our output, our quantity, is real GDP in this case, or income. And like a market demand curve, an aggregate demand curve can either increase or decrease depending upon which variables wind up shifting the curve. And let's take a look at this in the short run. An increase in aggregate demand is always a shift to the right, again similar to what we saw with a market demand curve, and vice versa, that a decrease in aggregate demand is always a shift of the curve to the left. Now there are 6 things and a whole set of variables that can cause a shift in aggregate demand. So let's take a look at the 6 and their variables. Here are the first 2 things: consumer consumption and consumer savings. And there are 7 variables that will have an impact on consumer consumption and savings. Here's the first variable: the inflation rate as it is relative to prices of products and services. Inflation will definitely have an impact on both consumption, what's bought and what can't be bought, and also levels of savings. The second variable is changes in preferences that come about in markets as a result of changing demographics. A third variable of the 7 is what expectations are for the future. For example, when we talked about inflation, if inflation is going up, people will wind up spending and consuming more in the short term because money is losing value, and that's going to help drive up demand. So and there could be a whole bunch of other sets of expectations for the future that have an effect too, but that's probably one of the easiest to understand. And here are the other 4 variables. The first one is interest rates. Obviously, if interest rates are high, it's going to discourage borrowing, which will in turn reduce demand or consumption for goods and services. The same way on the other side is that if interest rates are low, it's going to increase the incentive to borrow to be able to consume. The availability of credit. If you can't get a loan to satisfy a particular need you had, obviously that's going to limit your ability to consume. Income, if your income is static and the cost of living continually increases, that is going to have an impact on consumption. And levels of wealth also has an impact. The third thing that can cause a shift in aggregate demand is investment. And here we're talking about business investment, gross private domestic business investment. Businesses invest in their operations when they see opportunities to grow and maybe expand into other markets or expand their presence in markets, and they do not when they don't have a good outlook towards any potential expansion. So here are some variables that will have an impact from an investment standpoint. The first is number of consumers. If they see their market increasing in terms of more potential buyers, they'll certainly invest to match up with potential consumption. Another variable having an effect on investment are changes in people's preferences for goods and services. A third would be a business owner's expectations for the future. If costs are going to rise and they don't see a market opportunity there for the longer term to expand, they may hold back on their investments until the picture for the future looks a little bit brighter. Another variable is inventories. If the market changes for some reason and they've sunk some cost into carrying inventories, they'll shorten up on their investment, not look to expand, and not order more materials until they've been able to clear out what inventory they have. And the last is interest rates. Sometimes to invest to grow the business, businesses borrow, but if the cost of borrowing is too much, they'll hold back and not do that. The other side of the coin is if the interest rates are low and the market looks as though it has potential to expand, they'll borrow money to invest in the business and therefore increase demand for their supplies in their market, in the market to grow that business. The fourth thing that can cause a shift in aggregate demand is government spending. And the government, through its spending practices, can be a real heavyweight in having an impact on demand and supply in the overall economy. Now, government spending can be a good thing if it's on sensible things and done in an efficient manner. However, it's certainly bad if it is causing deficit situations, or if it's done inefficiently and winds up causing negative unintended consequences or negative externalities. The fifth thing that can have an effect on aggregate demand are taxes. Lowering taxes will certainly increase aggregate demand because it puts money back into the hands of the public, while new taxes or raising existing ones will certainly decrease aggregate demand for the opposite reason, in that it's taking money, disposable income and money, out of the hands of consumers. And the sixth item that can cause a shift in aggregate demand is the effective management of the money supply. And let me give you one example. If the Federal Reserve doesn't manage the money supply correctly and there's too much money floating around in the economy, we'll probably run a bout of inflation. And inflation does two things that are very troublesome. One, it will raise interest rates, which will decrease business investment and demand for money to be able to expand and grow businesses. But yet on the other side, if the inflation is raging, it will promote the opposite reaction from the consumer standpoint, because they'll want to spend their money sooner rather than later, because it would be losing value almost on a daily basis. So these types of things are very troublesome for the economy, can have an effect in tearing apart aggregate demand. And we'll look at further details about effective management of the money supply when we get to Chapter 19, and specifically look at the Federal Reserve and how it does that. Next, I'm going to give you some food for thought, and I'm going to introduce a concept here that I would like for you to think about and put away in the back of your mind for a little bit later on in this chapter. I'll bring it back, and I think it'll make a lot of sense to you. So here we go. Do you remember what our exaggerated demand curve looks like for a perfectly elastic good? We took a look at this just very briefly in Chapter 5 on demand when we introduced the concept of demand to you. It looks something like this, where we show complete 100% sensitivity to price. Now, I would like for you to keep in mind that chart that we just looked at for a perfectly elastic good. And I'm going to make a slight alteration to that, and I'm going to ask you to consider the following. What macroeconomic condition might be reflected by this chart if it was reflecting aggregate demand, meaning the total demand in a society or an economy? And here's our chart again, and here's the alteration that I've made. Take a look at the aggregate demand curve at the price level 1. I've significantly shortened it up. What macroeconomic condition might you think be reflected here by this? I'll suggest to you that it's a depression. And we'll take a deeper look at this as we move forward here. So just keep that tucked away in the back of your mind. Now, what about the other aggregate measurement and aggregate curve, the aggregate supply curve? Before we begin looking at aggregate supply, it is important to remember something that we covered back in Chapter 6 when we were talking about supply to a market specifically, that time to market plays a significant role in affecting levels of supply. We therefore need to be able to measure aggregate supply within an economy in both the long and the short term. So let's start our look at aggregate supply with the long run. And I have a question for you here. Do you remember me? And I'm sure you do. This is the old production possibilities curve that you were introduced to back in Chapter 2. The production possibilities curve represents the productive capacity of a society given all the resources that are available. And the productive capacity represents the total possible supply at full employment. So that leads us to a question. How long does it take for new resources to take effect so that the curve shifts, in this case to the right, and it increases the productive capacity of the society, and supply is therefore expanded? Well, it doesn't happen overnight, and for that matter, it doesn't happen over a couple of days. It takes a longer period of time. So if resources take time to add into the economy and take time for them to take effect, the long-term aggregate supply will not change or shift that often. Therefore, we could also represent this production possibilities curve in a little bit different way and represent it as a long-term aggregate supply curve. And it would look like this. And here's our long-term aggregate supply curve, a vertical line on the chart. And there's something to keep in mind when we illustrate long-run aggregate supply in this manner, that this assumes stable resources and full employment in the economy. Now, as I mentioned, it takes time to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. However, it will shift over time, and there are 10 variables that will shift the curve. Let's take a quick look at them. The first is the productive labor force. Obviously, if you have a population increase and it increases the productive labor force, or for that matter, if you increase immigration and that contributes to the productive labor force, it will shift the curve, and it will shift the curve to the right. The quantity and quality of natural resources make it available, more to be produced available, and that will shift the curve to the right. The quality and quantity of capital that's invested into the economy will do the same thing to make all the resources more productive, and it will shift the curve to the right. Increased health and education, increasing the skills of the workforce, making it more productive, will shift the curve to the right. Increases in technology, again, to make the labor force more productive, to be able to produce more goods and services, will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Business costs, I have it highlighted in a different color here because that can go one of two ways. If business costs are reduced, it'll shift the curve to the right over the long term. But if business costs are raised for some reason, it will shift the curve to the left. Business taxes, again, can go either way. If business taxes are reduced, it will shift the curve to the right. If business taxes are increased, it'll shift the curve to the left. Regulations, government regulations, this is. Same thing, regulations here, if they're added, they increase business costs. So it will wind up shifting the curve to the left as less would be supplied. And if regulations are disbanded or done away with, business costs will be lowered and it will shift the curve to the right. Research and development, money invested in developing new techniques, which then will lead to new technology, that will help shift the curve to the right. And supply shock would certainly shift the curve to the left and reduce the amount of raw materials, let's say, to be able to produce the goods and services that the economy had been producing. So we have 10 variables that can shift the long-run aggregate supply curve over time. Before we move on to taking a look at aggregate supply in the short run, I have a tip for you. On the AP exam, if you see the words in a question that read "in the long run," it's referring only to aggregate supply. Now let's move on to the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve is just like our market-specific supply curve. It is a downward sloping curve from right to left, just the way it is on a traditional supply and demand graph. And the reason for this is the same that we see in markets. At higher price levels, the quantity that's supplied is more than when price levels are lower. We know that at lower prices, suppliers get disinterested in supplying products and services to a market. Now, what shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve are the same types of things that shift a market-oriented supply curve. Short-term business costs, in particularly labor rates, if those increase, it costs businesses more to produce, and in the short term they produce less. Or if the business has an increase in the cost of some of its supplies in the short term, it will produce less, moving the supply curve to the left until it can pass on the costs to its consumers. So again, I have some food for thought for you, and that is, what possibly could cause this? And what I mean by that is, what macroeconomic condition for an economy might cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to look like this? And again, this is an exaggerated situation. And similar to what we saw with the exaggerated aggregate demand curve, I'd suggest to you that this represents pretty close to what it would look like in a depression situation. And we'll discuss more about this in a few minutes. So I have now given you some information on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And those are components of the modern way that we measure overall economic conditions. There are some additional things that I need to tell you beyond what I have already shown you about aggregate supply and demand. But before I do, I need to take you back in history a little bit to show you where we have come and where everything started, and it would help you better understand how we arrived at where we're at today. And in doing so, we're going to look at exactly where macroeconomic measurements started back in the early to mid 1900s. And it started with something that's called the Keynesian expenditure model. And sometimes this model is called the Keynesian cross, because it's a graphical model that I'll show you here in a second. But before I do that and show you the expenditure model, the Keynesian cross, I'd like to talk for a second about the man whose picture is in the upper right-hand side of the screen. That is John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous economic philosophers and economists of all time. John Maynard Keynes is effectively considered the father of the study of macroeconomics, and it's his name that's on this expenditure model. So now let's take a look at the Keynesian cross and see where this whole idea of managing or illustrating, I shouldn't say managing, illustrating an economy's overall condition came from. So here we have our Keynesian cross or expenditure model. Let me explain a little bit about the graph that's in front of you. And I'll start with, as I normally do, with the axes. We have our x-axis labeled as real GDP or income, Y. And Keynes was the first one to do that, and that hasn't changed from what you've seen with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We represent the x-axis as real GDP. However, over on the y-axis, Keynes did not put price level. That's a more modern evolution of measurement here. What Keynes used on the y-axis was aggregate expenditures. Okay, in his model, there were some assumptions that price levels are held constant and we have no market disruptions. Now you may say, well, both those things aren't true, but think where we're at this time. We're trying to get an initial snapshot, an idea of how to begin to manage, or I keep using the word manage, begin to illustrate economic conditions. So he wanted to take a snapshot in time, and he's saying, okay, assume for the moment that there are price levels are held constant and that there are no market disruptions. And if that's the case, given a normally functioning economy, you could illustrate real GDP by using a 45-degree curve that represents real GDP and the based upon aggregate expenditure. Now, the inputs for the expenditure he illustrated with a second curve, and the inputs are the same. You'll notice that I say the same, you'll notice in the equation for GDP, and it was Keynes who came up with the whole idea of how GDP is measured. You see the consumption, the investment, plus the government spending, plus the net exports, and he put all this together in an expenditure for a given year or at a certain point in time and represented it with a curve on the graph. Now, where the two curves intersect, the 45-degree curve representing real GDP and the inputs curve, he called the equilibrium point for an economy where the planned aggregate expenditure equals the production. Now, Keynes was able to take his very simple expenditure model and begin to illustrate with it some changes in economic conditions. And it gets the point across, but it doesn't explain things as well as a more sophisticated modern model that we use today that we'll get to in a few moments. But let me show you what Keynes was able to do with his model. He said, when you had a situation that would occur like something like overproduction or excess inventories for some reason, this is the point that you would be on the expenditure curve. And what that would wind up causing is things to be overproduced, and businesses and the investment aspect of things would cut back because of the excess. And then you would wind up having an economic slowdown as spending slows or stops to rebalance the economy. And it's that picture between real GDP and where the expenditure level was that illustrates the period of a recession. Now, I want to stop for a moment because I use the term recession, and I know I haven't defined that for you. And we're going to look at recessions, depressions, and economic expansions in the next chapter, chapter 16, because they're component parts of the business cycle. But I think you can see what Keynes was getting at, and also let me give you, for our purposes here, just a short definition for recession that'll serve our purpose for the time. A recession is a decline, a steady decline over a few months and for a short period of time of real GDP. And that's what he was illustrating on the prior chart. But now let's take it a step forward and let's put ourselves in Keynes's shoes, and he would say something like this based upon the example we've just looked at. He'd say, okay, but what if you did want to grow the economy up to that point on real GDP that the expenditure level should really result in from a market equilibrium standpoint? And what you need to do to make that happen is you need to increase private investment, not government spending, to get that accomplished, and raise the curve. Keynes believed that government spending, however, can help promote business investment. And that is true to a certain degree. And we will look at more about that in what effects government spending has and how the government goes about doing it in a few minutes in chapter 18, which is the fiscal policy chapter. But having the government spending stimulate private investment is a difficult thing to do. It's hard to do. And a lot of times the government spending just winds up being transfer payments, and that does not promote growth. So it needs to be carefully watched. So the question becomes, yeah, government spending can help contribute to the private investment, but how do you really encourage this private investment to occur to increase worker productivity and plant and factory productivity and so forth, so that you can grow the economy to the level that we see here? It's represented by the red dot. So how do we encourage the private investment to occur? Well, investment is closely related to borrowing. And what's attractive to borrowers for investment are interest rates, especially low interest rates. So let me illustrate here how we encourage this by using a simple graph, a demand graph, that we're changing slightly the labels on the axes for. The demand graph that we're looking at here is called an investment demand chart. And on the x-axis, we have investment volume. And on the y-axis, we have it labeled as the interest rate. And at a certain interest rate, a cost of money to borrow, there will be X amount of investment. And if the interest rate is lowered, it will spur on more investment, and the greater private investment will create economic growth. Now, interest rates are controlled by the actions of the Federal Reserve Bank through monetary policy, and that's what we take a look at in depth in chapter 19. And we'll come back to that later. Now, a moment ago, I talked about Keynes talking about government spending having an effect on private investment. And I also mentioned that it's difficult many times to control the type of spending, and a lot of times it just winds up being transfer payments which don't promote economic growth. Well, another government action could actually be, and in this case it usually winds up being far more effective than just pure government spending, is for the government to change the tax rate because it has the same type of effect in terms of, in this case, affecting consumption by businesses and consumers, that if the tax rate is lowered, it puts more money into the pockets of consumers and businesses, and that gets turned around most times into private investment and consumption, which will promote the growth. Now that we've looked at how John Maynard Keynes has gotten us started on macroeconomic measurements and illustrations, and how I've also introduced you to the component parts of how we look at things in a modern way by explaining what aggregate demand and aggregate supply is, it's time to introduce you to what we call the modern model for illustrating overall economic conditions. And let me step you through it. I think you'll find it fairly easy to understand based upon what we've covered so far. Here we've gone back to our graph and we have our axes labeled along the lines of the aggregate supply and demand components. In the modern model, we have the x-axis representing real GDP or income, and the y-axis labeled as price level. Now, here I'm referencing back to the concepts that I introduced or refreshed you on earlier, which were the exaggerated curves for aggregate supply and aggregate demand that I said suggested the condition of a depression. And as you can see, the aggregate demand curve, in reality, and that's why I used the word exaggerated before, the aggregate demand curve is not completely horizontal. There is a slight tilt to it, and this is a better representation, but I think you get the idea. This illustration that you see right here with the aggregate supply and demand curve on this graph represents the illustration of the overall economic conditions during the Great Depression, when we had 30% unemployment, upwards of 30% and greater unemployment in this country. There was very little demand and obviously little supply because of the low demand. Now, ironically, because John Maynard Keynes started to talk about macroeconomic measurements and how to solve conditions like the Great Depression, and he created his expenditure model during the Great Depression, this section of our graph is called the Keynesian range. Now, Keynes, as well as other economists, now understand that when you're coming out of a depression like this, and if you encourage the business or private investment that we took a look at just a few moments ago, what will happen is that demand will start to pick up, both consumer and business demand. And when that happens, we will see a shifting of the tilting of our aggregate demand curve. And once that starts to happen, it has an impact on pulling up the aggregate supply curve as well back to closer to more normal conditions. And when this starts to happen, we label this period of time the intermediate range, where we have a recovering economy from either a recession or, in this case, we're illustrating a deep depression. But we're not finished here in our modern model in illustrating overall economic conditions, because in the recovering economy, in the intermediate range, we're still not at full employment, at full capacity based upon our resources. And we're not illustrating here a long-run aggregate supply curve. And that brings us to our next point. Here's our long-run aggregate supply curve where the economy has recovered completely, and we're back to the traditional supply output that we have based upon full employment and using all of our resources, and demand has recovered as the aggregate demand curve continually moves to the right to match up to the supply. And when the economy reaches this, kind of like a way to describe it is hitting on all cylinders, we call this the classical range. It's the illustration of a stable, full functioning economy with full employment or unemployment being at the 4 to 5% unemployment range. And this is our modern model that was built off of what John Maynard Keynes started and how we illustrate the overall conditions in our economy today. The next thing that we'll do in this chapter is to consider some secondary measurements of economic performance, which are really complementary measurements to the ones that we've looked at so far, particularly GDP. So let's take a look at these. There are actually 6 measures that complement gross domestic product. Here's the first. It's called gross national product, or GNP. And what GNP is the measure of annual income earned by U.S.-owned businesses or firms and residents. This does not account for something that we call depreciation, and depreciation is a financial term. And what depreciation means is the loss of value of capital equipment that results from normal wear and tear. And before I tell you about the other 5 measures that we'll be looking at here, let me offer you a tip for a way to keep them organized, which will help you then recall them later on. And that tip is that these measures are really in a cascading organization, meaning that one is a subset of the other. We've just looked at gross national product, which is really in many ways a subset of GDP. So the next one that I'm going to tell you about is a subset of GNP, and that measure is net national product, NNP. It is the gross national product, GNP, minus that cost of depreciation that I spoke about a few moments ago. In other words, it's net output after the adjustment for depreciation. Then, cascading from there, we have national income, or NI. That is net national product less sales and excise taxes on businesses. And from there, we have what we call personal income, or PI. That is pre-tax income paid to households after businesses invest and pay other expenses. And from the personal income, PI, we can then derive disposable personal income, or DPI. And that's the money that people actually have to spend after they pay their taxes. And the 6th measure is one that doesn't cascade under the others, and we have touched on a little bit before, but let's get a formal definition on it. It's GDP per capita, which is real GDP divided by the total population of a society or a country or an economy. And that's considered, GDP per capita, to be the best measure of a nation's standard of living. Now, as we move to wrap up Chapter 15, we're going to conclude by looking at the factors that promote economic growth. And savings and investing plays a big role in this. And it reminds me of a very famous quote from Henry Hazlitt, that savings, in short, is only another form of spending and consumption that leads to economic growth. So let's look at these factors. And there are 6 factors that promote economic growth. And the first one is something I mentioned a moment ago, savings. Savings is defined as income not used for consumption directly. What savings does is that it leads to something we call capital deepening, the process of increasing the amount of capital per worker. In other words, it's the investment in physical or human capital that winds up increasing output per worker. The third factor that promotes economic growth is very easy to understand, and that's population growth. It fuels consumption. Obviously, if there are more people added to the economy or the society or the nation, more gets consumed. The fourth factor promoting economic growth is related to taxes and the money supply. The government plays, and I should also say the government and the Federal Reserve play a big role in having an impact on investment. Lower taxes increases investment. Proper management of the money supply will help encourage further investment. The fifth factor is foreign trade. And here's something that a lot of people have a tough time understanding when they first hear it. And let me explain to you how it works. Even a trade deficit can promote capital deepening. Now, a trade deficit is when a country imports more than it exports. And when that happens, as we've had here in the United States, we're importing more because the cost of the goods or the prices of the goods that we're importing are less expensive. And when you have to pay less for goods that you need, it frees up more of your disposable income that could wind up going to savings. And when money is put into savings, it helps promote capital deepening. So through a trade deficit where we're purchasing goods at lower prices, improving our standard of living, we're also increasing savings and investment and helping to promote and fuel growth. And the sixth factor that promotes growth is technological progress. And I'd like to talk about technological progress here in a couple of ways. First, let's work here on a definition for technological progress. And what we mean by that is an increase in efficiency gained by producing more outputs without using more inputs. And a question usually comes up is, well, how can this be measured? And we measure it these days by using something that's called Solow's method. Dr. Solow, who you see, whose picture here is in the upper right-hand corner, is Professor Emeritus from MIT, and he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Robert Solow, who developed this method. And the way the method works is that we subtract the growth in output in the economy from the increases in capital in the economy from the increase in labor. Simple equation that's used and helps to measure technological progress and growth and productivity. Periodically, just about every quarter, if you turn on the business news, about every 3 months, you'll hear a report pretty faithfully on the measurement using Solow's method as to whether the United States workforce has either increased or decreased productivity. And the figure or percentage in growth or lack thereof that they talk about is developed using Robert Solow's method. The other thing I want to mention about technological progress and productivity are the things that drive it, and it really boils down to 4 things. Here's the first: scientific research that's done to improve technology, and that leads to the increases in productivity. Second, innovation and new ideas for profit. This goes to the incentive basis in our economy and in our society. As long as we keep a competitive environment that provides the incentive for innovation based on profit, we will have technological progress. The third thing is the scale of the market. New ideas have to be incented by an innovation incentive by being able to take advantage of economies in the market to be able to make the profit and make it worthwhile. So the scale of the market that new ideas and innovations are applied to is also important towards driving technological progress. There needs to be enough there. And the last thing, the fourth, is the level of education and experience. And not only will that help to drive the technological progress, but in return, education and experience will provide the ability to handle and create the progress that's associated with it. This brings us to an end to Chapter 15 on our measurements of economic performance. Chapter 16 continues on this theme generally, in that we're looking at some higher level categories of performance and how the economic conditions can be interpreted. Chapter 16's title is Business Cycles, and we look forward to seeing you there.